Good afternoon. This is Chapter 16, Part 2, Introduction to Romanticism. I'm going to talk about rubato. And rubato is a term that we definitely want to know. And it's associated with the Romantic style, or the Romantic period. You're not going to have this in the Baroque era. You're not going to have it in classical music. Okay. And what composers are doing, or what performers are doing, is instead of having a very strict pulse, they're going to stretch that pulse at specific times. So rubato, it means Italian. It means rob time, and they're going to stretch and compress the beat. And this exaggeration of the rhythmic flow gives us more emotion and more affection. Okay, it gives performers more artistic freedom, and we see this in a lot of composers. We definitely see it in the music of Chopin. Okay, and a lot of his piano music, you have to use this. It's essential. Okay, but we'll also see it in the music, some in Schumann and in Liszt and so forth. Now I have a listening example from Schubert. So sorry, we have a listening example from Chopin's Prelude in E minor, and it has these chords playing in the left hand and this kind of simple melody in the right hand. But what I want you to listen for is the performer will speed up and slow down. He's not going to play those eighth notes steadily, okay? And he's going to speed up or slow down depending on where the music is to the phrase. Let's listen. And again, this use of rubato, it gets more affection and more freedom for the composer to have more expression. With the Romantic style, we see bigger is better. Okay, and it's going to be in a kind of use of the extremes in the Romantic period. Okay, so we see greater lengths and scopes of the art and ideas. We're going to see monumental compositions, and the best example is the symphony. Again, Mozart and Haydn symphonies about 20-25 minutes. But the Berlioz Symphony Fantastique, well, that's about an hour long. Okay, and then when we get to Mahler, and Mahler's at the end of the Romantic period, he's writing about an hour and a half long symphonies, and so they get much more larger. Okay, we start to see extreme dynamic levels. Okay, and I mentioned this before in another lecture. So instead of just having piano or pianissimo or forte, we're going to have pianinissimo or fortissimo. Okay, and keep in mind, dynamics they're somewhat subjective, but we're going to have these extreme in dynamics, and then we're going to have more instruments. Okay, the classical orchestra, maybe 45, instruments, but we're going to have a lot more instruments in the Romantic period. Okay, we're going to have up to eight horns. A lot more brass. We're going to need more strings to balance out that brass section. We're going to have more percussion, not only just the timpani, but we'll have non-pitch percussion like the triangle, the bass drum, cymbals. And then we'll put more percussion instruments of color, like maybe the xylophone or marimba, or even the celeste. We'll have the harp is now going to be a staple in the Romantic period. In fact, many composers will use two harps. So you have these things going into the Romantic period. Again, bigger is better, kind of thing. That's the aesthetic here. The Romantic orchestra. So a couple things lead to the Romantic orchestra being much larger. Obviously, composers are putting more instruments in the orchestra. And then we have technological advances. We have the Industrial Revolutions happening, so we can now mass produce instruments, and we can even make them better. A couple examples would be the flute. It's now made of silver, And we have fingering mechanisms that really kind of make them more technically able. You have trumpets and French horns, and towards the early 19th century, they start to put valves in them. And now that the French horn and trumpet have valves in them, they can be more versatile and they can play in many different keys. Okay, so that's a huge innovation for the instruments. So we'll see also new instruments added to the orchestra. Okay, we're going to see new standard instruments. So the piccolo. Okay, the piccolo is like a smaller flute. It's the kind of the highest playing instrument in the orchestra. The trombone and tuba and the cornet are added to the brass section. The English horn and the contrabassoon are added in the woodwinds. Now we have the bassoon, and the contrabassoon is probably the lowest instrument of the orchestra. Again, so we're going to add more bass, especially when we have the trombones in there and the tuba, that contrabassoon. And composers are going to write for that. They're going to really, really exploit the colors and that extra level of added bass to it. Harps are going to be added, and the harps are great because they can play kind of in the background of the orchestra. They can have these great glissandos and great effects as well. So they're going to add more color to the orchestra. And as I said, percussion. The percussion is becoming the new standard orchestral family in the 19th century. When we looked at Beethoven and the classical composers, they'd have a timpani, and they might have like a triangle or cymbals, but in the Romantic orchestra, the percussion is definitely the instruments kind of grow, and it's a staple family, just like the woodwinds or brass or violins. Romantic orchestra. When we look at this diagram, it kind of really, really displays the growth of the orchestra across the Romantic period. So when we look at Mozart, his symphony in G minor, it's 36 performers, and it's 20 minutes long. But we fast forward a little over 40 years, and we have Berlioz and his Symphonie Fantastique. Now his Symphonie Fantastique is almost an hour long; it's 55 minutes, and it's got 89 performers. Okay, and it's got that percussion in there. It's got the timpani, the bass drum, the snare drum. And then Mahler's a phenomenal symphonist, and he's a great, what we call, late Romantic composer. He's coming at the end of the Romantic period, kind of on the cusp of the 20th century. And if you look at the performing forces in his first symphony are huge, 129 performers, and it's an hour and a half long. So we went from 20 minutes in Mozart, fast forward, almost 100 years later, it's an hour and a half. So, as I said, it's that we're growing in size, we're growing in length. Conductor. Now, during the 1900s, we have the golden age for large concert halls. And we start to see a ton of these concert halls being built and utilized throughout the Romantic period. And every major town is going to have a concert hall, and they're going to have their own orchestra playing or opera house playing in their town or city. So we have the role of the conductor expanded, and mind you, the conductor, it starts the orchestra, it leads the rehearsals, and so forth. But now we have a more complex music is needed. The conductor is in charge of interpreting the music. How is this music going to be expressed? So it went from just being, they call it, a traffic cop, or setting the tempo and so forth. Now the conductor is going to be the interpreter of the music. The conductors start using a baton. Okay, because you have a larger orchestra, the baton's kind of an extension of your hand. So it's definitely being utilized. Another thing that the conductor will start doing is being kind of the face of the orchestra. Selecting the programming, running the rehearsals of the orchestra as well. So these are definitely other things that a conductor is responsible for as well, rather than just what we see during a performance. Another aspect of the 19th century is the idea of a virtuoso. And we start to see, all these concert halls being built throughout Europe in the 19th century. People and musicians are touring. They're going from town to town to town, performing usually their music or showcasing others' music. And we start to see a lot of these performers playing at a really, really high advanced level. Okay, they're really kind of performing these unprecedented heights, doing these acrobatics either on the piano, on the violin. Lots of times, some of these performers would use tricks or gimmicks. A couple virtuosos of the time would be Franz Liszt, okay, phenomenal pianist and composer, and then Niccolo Paganini. And Paganini was a virtuoso at the violin. You have a picture of him here. And they would go out on stage and they would play all these crazy, difficult pieces, kind of wow the audience. In addition, though, these musicians became rock stars of the era. Women would swoon and faint in their presence. People would try and steal their clothes, and it would be kind of like what people do with the rock stars today. I look at if you guys ever think about like Beatlemania, when the Beatles come in the '60s to the U.S. and everyone's crazy about them. This is kind of like the first example of that. So we have here the attraction of the virtuoso is kind of that of a circus performer. There's always hope that something disastrous would happen. And what they mean by that is they're kind of walking this tightrope. They're playing this really, really, really intense, difficult music. And people are expecting something to happen. Maybe the piece comes apart, maybe make a wrong note. And usually it doesn't happen. But it's that kind of intensity of the music and kind of focus of the audience for these guys that really capture audiences in the 19th century. So this concludes chapter 16. Again, this is just an overview of the Romantic period. So please tune in to chapter 17, where we're going to be talking about the art song.